Good afternoon. Welcome to Understanding Forecasting webinar organized by the Associazione Allievi of the Collegio Carlo Alberto, on the behalf of which I'm talking to you right now, and supported by the Fondazione Collegio Carlo Alberto. I have the privilege to welcome Mr. Carlos Montes-Galdòn. Welcome, Carlos, and Emil Bandoni. Emil is a financial stability analyst at BCE and former Allievo of the Collegio Carlo Alberto, and he will tell us more about our guest and the framework of this seminar. The webinar is officially and proudly part of the Financial Literacy Month by the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. And this event aims at widespread of knowledge and concern about the fundamental topic of macroeconomic forecasting. Our mission, the mission of the Associazione Allievi, will go on over the next month with new events. So please keep up to date through our social networks, in particular with Instagram and LinkedIn, and on the Collegio webpage. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that we will have a Q&A session at the very ending of the seminar. So I kindly invite you to pose all your questions through the specific tool that you can access from the bottom of Zoom and on the center of your screen. So once more, thank you, Emil, and thank you, Carlos. And Emil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. So we try to keep it super short to leave more time to our guest. So our guest is Carlos Montes-Galdòn, which holds a PhD in economics at Columbia University and is currently lead economist at the division forecasting and policy modeling at the ECB. So we'll explain us today some insights of how forecast works, why it is important for our everyday life, and at the end also some more minutes on how traineeships at the ECB works and why one should apply for a traineeship there. So okay, I kept this super short, so then now there is more time for our guest for questions later. So thank you for following this seminar, and thank you for the people which are following from for the Collegio in person. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emil. Thank you very much, Davide. And thank you very much to all of you for inviting me and for coming to this seminar. So the seminar is called Understanding Forecasting, and let me emphasize first that so what I am going to say represents only my own views, and is not necessarily representative of what the ECB thinks or the Eurosystem. So this is quite important. Also that I would have loved to do it in Italian, but unfortunately my Italian is very bad, so I'm not going to be able to do it. So let me go. I have some supporting slides, but I will mostly chat and talk. And the idea would be to give you some insights of what forecasting is. How do we do forecasting in an institution like the ECB, or at least as much as I can tell you, which is public, and also trying to convince you why forecasts are important, and to try to give you also an idea on how you should think as an economist when you want to do a forecast, okay? So I will not go so much about this, no, but I mean, if you want to know a little bit more about me, or if you ever want to contact me, so you have here my email or even my Twitter handle, if it is easier. And so I studied economics back in Spain, and then as Emil said, then I did my PhD in the United States. And I have been working at the ECB since 2015. I started in a division which is called Prices and Costs, and then I moved to another one which is called Forecasting and Policy Modeling. No? And since the very beginning, I have been quite involved in the forecasting process of the ECB. At the beginning, first focusing mostly on inflation developments or on wages developments in the euro area, and now in the Forecasting and Policy Modeling division is more a broader perspective in which we produce forecasts that are much more technical, or at least we cross-check other forecasts that are produced inside the ECB. I will keep it like this because I think it's when I did the full screen is when it went wrong. So anyway, so just in case you have here my email and the Twitter thing, in case you ever want to contact me, I'm open to talk to you whenever you want, of course, finding the proper time and so on. So, or in any case, you can just look for my name and it shows up. So let me start by trying to explain to you why we think that economic forecasting, what it is, and why do we think that it is important, okay? Now, this presentation that I'm going to give to you, I understand that most of you are economists or that you are studying economics, so there will be a little bit of technicalities, not so many, okay? But I will try to do it so that everybody can follow me or who can understand the things that I am going to say. But let me start with a couple of quotes. This is from a very old paper, when economic forecasting using models was starting. And these two people, Elliott and Timmerman, these are two of the big names in economics who have done a lot of work in statistical forecasting in economics. And they always emphasized in their books or in their papers that forecasts actually are important for everybody to make decisions in their daily lives, right? In economics and in finance. But you need to understand those forecasts in relation of some specific context. And I will talk about this a bit later, why this context is important, the narrative. And then, of course, forecast is also very important, as they say here, in all areas of economics and finance, when I have to make a decision, but I am facing a very uncertain future. Okay, like for example, right now we are living in a very uncertain period. So making forecasts right now is very difficult, but then forecasting becomes even more important in this situation. So when I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking, okay, so the first thing that we need to come up with is some definition of forecast, okay? And usually, if you check around, you see that there is like a very narrow definition of what forecasting is. It's like to predict future economic variables based on historical data or correlations. Yeah, fine. But nowadays, that is only a very small aspect of what actually economic forecasting is, or how forecasts are produced in policy institutions, in ministries, and so on. So I would say that a more broader definition is to make an informed assessment about future economic variables, not just a number, but we want to have like an informed different scenarios about the future. Of course, based on historical data, based on historical correlations of the data, but also trying to understand how those variables interact among each other, and also trying to consider things that are still not present in the data. For example, in January or in February of this year, we started to know that there was going to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that is not something that we had in the data. And we had to come up with forecasts that take into account this information, right? So this leads to a very broad literature or a lot of different aspects that are related to forecasting. This includes something which is called nowcast, then something which is called unconditional forecast, conditional scenarios, and risk analysis. And now, one thing that I can tell you, forecasting in economics is very difficult. And it's probably one of the least pleasant things to do in economics, because it's very difficult to get forecasts that are right. It requires a lot of work. It requires many economic models. It requires economic theory, economic judgment, and also a huge amount of good data. So, okay, we have a definition, but then why is economic forecasting important? Why do we think that it is important? So let me just give you some examples, and then I will focus on a very specific one, which I think it's one of the most important ones in the real world. But for example, suppose that you are the owner of a company, and you are trying to decide if you want to buy a new machine or if you want to install a new factory. So if you have done some classes in corporate finance or also in macro and so on, so you will have heard probably of what is the net present discounted value of an investment. And the idea is, I'm going to buy a machine today, and I expect that this machine is going to help me to produce new things in the future. And I will be able to sell those things in the future. So the present discounted value of the machine is going to be all those future streams of cash, all those future profits that I might get in the future thanks to the machine, but that is going to be discounted by the interest rate, because time is money, and the interest rate somewhat is the price of time or the price of money over time. Now, so you can see here that in order to make my decision, I need to make forecasts about what are going to be my profits if I install the machine, but also about the interest rate. $100 today is not the same as $100 in 10 years from now. Okay, so I need to make this forecast. Otherwise, I could go very wrong and I can lose a lot of money if I buy the machine and then I was very, very wrong about the expected profits that I can get thanks to the machine. But of course, then, when it comes to the context of setting our wages, no? So it is very important when you are setting your wages or when you are trying to agree on your wages with your employers, for example, is what is going to be expected inflation about the future, no? Over next year? What is going to be my forecast of inflation? Because if I expect a much higher inflation, I would like to ask for a higher wage. Otherwise, I'm going to be losing purchasing power. So expectations about inflation are very, very important. Same, should the government build a new bridge or a new highway? What is the impact of demographic changes? This is very important when you are in a society in which people are getting very, very old. This is very important for the sustainability of the pension systems. But also, an important thing is how to prepare a government budget, for example, for the next year. This requires, and you see it all the time, no? That all the governments every year or every quarter, they are updating their forecasts about the future. Because having a good forecast for next year is critical to build the budget, the government budget. And let me give you this as an example. And I promised you that this and the next slide are the only slides where I might have some equations for you, no? But if we consider a government, so we know that economies, households, governments, we are subject to budget constraints. We cannot buy everything that we want, no? But it's very easy to see, that the change in the debt of the government, this BT minus 1, so this is government spending minus taxes that the government is going to collect, plus the interest that I have to pay on the debt that I have from yesterday. Okay, so this is going to be the deficit of the government. So if I spend more than what I get from taxes, then I have a deficit, and then I need to issue more debt in order to pay for that additional government spending. This is just an identity. This is not an assumption. This is mathematics. Okay, now, no need to go over this, no, but I can, that in economics, we don't care about the value of things in euros, we care about real value of things, no? So let me divide by the price level, let me divide by GDP, and then we get something like this, which just says that the real value of debt over GDP is this deficit plus this adjusted interest rate payment. But the interesting thing is that, I have here something that is debt today depends on debt yesterday, which means that debt tomorrow depends on debt today, and so on and so on. And then if you do that, you see that the real value of debt today depends on this sum that goes to a long period, to up to infinity if you want, on the expected difference between taxes and government spending. It depends on this A, which is going to be the expected GDP growth, and also on R, which is the expected real interest rate, okay? And it is discounting again, because, again, as I said before, 100 euros today is not the same as 100 euros tomorrow, and so on. Now, this is a condition which is called a solvency condition, and this is something that is used a lot in ministries, in international institutions, the IMF, a bit more complicated than this, okay? But this is a very, very simple example. And this is why, for example, the IMF makes for every country, they make forecasts about how GDP growth is going to be over the next years, how interest rates are going to evolve over the next years, how taxes and government spending is going to evolve over the next years. Because, for example, suppose that a government says, yeah, I'm going to increase government spending a lot over the next years, but you're not going to change taxes, GDP growth is not going to change, the interest rate is not going to change. So the value of debt that you can have is much lower. So if you try to get much more debt than that, the interest rates might go up a lot. And this is what has happened, for example, very recently to the UK, when the now former Prime Minister announced this plan in which he was just cutting taxes, but there was no readjustment on government spending or on the deficit of the government. That it was not a credible plan, because at the end, all the governments are subject to things like this. And therefore, it is very important that when you build or when you are writing a government budget, you need to consider all these forecasts about GDP, taxes. Taxes are very related also to GDP. okay, about the interest rates and so on. So you see that it's very important to have this forecast. It's going to impact you because, of course, for example, if the interest rate in the debt of the government goes up, the interest rate that you will pay also for your mortgages, for your loans, will also go up most likely. So what is the role of institutions for the forecast? No, why do institutions like the ECB or the IMF or the Ministry of Finance, why do they do this forecast beside this? No, so you can see here, for example, so this comes from the ECB's projection report that is public. So you see, we have projections for real GDP, for inflation until 2024, and we have several institutions who are doing it for the euro area. Okay, so we have the ECB staff. This is what we produce. Then there is Consensus Economics, the IMF, the European Commission, the OECD. And you see that there is actually a variety of numbers, no? And this implies that maybe they are using different models, maybe they have different economic narratives behind it, there are different stories, right? And you can see that, for example, inflation in 2023, there are a lot of different values, no? So it depends on many things, depends on the forecaster. Which one is right? That you can only know ex post, no? But then one important thing is that we also provide, at least from the ECB, when we do a forecast, we take into consideration many things. For example, when I want to do a forecast for GDP or for inflation, I have to consider what's happening with the interest rate, what's happening with oil prices, what is happening with gas prices, what is happening with the exchange rate. All these variables are going to have a strong impact on my forecast, no? And then these are what we call, and this is important, I will come about this probably later, what we call technical assumptions. A technical assumption is some numbers that we take as given, and we take it, for example, from the markets expect, and we use those numbers to construct our forecast using our models or using some informed judgment. But why do we do this? No? So why do we do this? First of all, because of transparency, okay? We know that any institution, the ECB, the IMF, when we make a decision, in our case, when we decide to change the interest rate, when we decide to change the path of our asset purchases, in the case of the IMF, if they decide to lend money to a country. So this is very influential, and this can change the lives of many people. If we publish our forecast, if we publish how we are doing the forecast, so this helps the public, helps people to understand what is the economic story behind this forecast. Also, producing forecast is very costly. It requires a lot of models, a lot of experts, a lot of data, and a lot of understanding of what is going on in the economy. Not everybody can afford to do that. So it is good that different institutions are able to provide this forecast so that every other agent in the economy can actually rely on those forecasts to make their decisions about the future. A very small company, it's very difficult for this small company to make a fair assessment of how GDP is going to be over the next years if they are trying to decide to build a factory or not. And also, one important thing is that people are generally risk averse. Some people are risk averse. In my case, for example, I'm very risk averse. I hate uncertainty. I want to know things that are clear for the future. Of course, I am asking too much. It's impossible. But when you are at a central bank or an institution, a government institution, it's good to provide this forecast because this reduces uncertainty for the public. When there is a lot of uncertainty, bad things can happen. So it is not the same if I tell you that tomorrow GDP can be between, I don't know, GDP growth can be between 1.9 and 2.1%, or if I tell you that it is going to be between -5% and 5%. Because if I tell you that GDP growth can be very negative next year, you will think, okay, but then it is likely that I become unemployed next year. And if I become unemployed next year, maybe I should start saving now. And if I start saving now, I'm going to consume less. And then GDP will drop today. So you can see all this cascade of events. So it is very important to provide certainty and to provide a fair assessment of how we think that the economy is going to evolve. And this was very critical right after the global financial crisis of 2008. and also during the COVID-19 pandemic. So at the ECB, we started to use more clearly what is called forward guidance. We were saying the interest rates, we are going to keep the interest rates low for longer. We are going to buy 80 billions of assets over each month for the next year. So we were telling people exactly what we were going to do so that the markets were not disrupted so much, okay? And of course, the key forward guidance point was the whatever it takes, right? So at the moment, the markets were betting on different governments to default in the euro area. That moment was like, no, the ECB is not going to let these governments to default. So this is a forecasting statement, right? It's a forecasting statement. I am saying that I'm not going to let that happen. And then markets reacted very fast to that. And many bad things were avoided at the moment. So how do we do forecast at the ECB? So this is a bit of an institutional slide. In a moment, I will go again to more technical things or more practical things, no? But at the ECB, and this is supposed to be, I'm not sure why at the PDF it has disappeared. I saw it before, I corrected, and it is like this again. But anyway, the idea is that there are some projection exercises that we call either BMP or MP. It depends. A BMP, all the central banks in Europe are involved in producing the forecast. There are a lot of people involved, you cannot imagine. And that is done in June and in December. And then we have what we call the MP, and this is done only by ECB staff. And this is done in March and in September. But we are also in talks with the members from the NCBs because, I mean, Banca d'Italia probably knows much more about the Italian economy than we do at the ECB. So we need to keep talking to them, and it is very important for us. We do projections, or we do forecasts for the next 3 years, for every quarter over the next 3 years. For inflation, we also have forecasts that are monthly, but only for the next 11 months, so up to 1 year. Then how do we do the projections if this is of interest of you? So we do projections or forecasts for every country in the euro area, for Spain, Italy, Germany, France, all of them, and then we aggregate that, and that gives us the forecast for the euro area. Important thing, these projections are conditional on these technical assumptions that I told you. So that is, we assume a path for oil prices, we assume a path for gas prices, we assume a path for the exchange rate. And given those values, then we construct our forecast for GDP, consumption, inflation, and so on. Of course, getting these paths also requires a different forecast, okay? But that's a different story. And at the end, our final forecast is just a combination of different things. We use a lot of economic models, macroeconomic models, econometrics. We use a lot of econometrics. If you want to work at the ECB or at another international institution nowadays, you need to know a lot of econometrics. And then judgment. Judgment is, okay, there are many things that you cannot capture with your models, but I know that are out there. So look, what I mentioned before. No? So in January this year, it was very difficult that you would get a model that will give you a 10% HICP inflation, right? But if you knew that, there is a war in Ukraine, there is going to be supply restrictions on gas, the price of gas is going to increase a lot, even if the model cannot capture this, you can put that in the model. And then you can see what would be the implied path for inflation or for GDP. Now, how do we actually, because this is in practice, so we study economics, or some of you are still studying economics, I studied economics, I did a lot of technical things, and at the end is how do we use the economics that you learn at the university or in a PhD, how do we use that for forecasting? So first of all, let's see where we can use a model, in this full forecasting process. So when you want to do a forecast, if you want to do a projection, the important thing, first of all, is always to take data. Okay, so you need data. Nowadays, there are many people that say that in economics, we are doing a lot of, I'm not sure if I can say this word, but I mean, anyway, that we do a lot of bullshitting, that it's not scientific at all. That is not true. This is people who got stuck in economics back in the 60s, in the 70s. Nowadays, economics is data-driven, we use a lot of data, we use a lot of empirical models. Economic theory plays a role, of course, but there are many things that within economics that are economic theory free, okay, and that are mostly data-driven. And it is very unfair when people say these things because, okay, maybe we are not an exact science, but we do many things that are scientific, even if at the end forecast, as I said, it's very difficult to do forecast, and many times we are going to get them wrong. Then, given the data, we collect all the data that we have at each period of time, right? So we first of all try to understand what is the current economic conditions. For example, GDP is published only every quarter, every 3 months. But I would like to know at each period of time when I am doing my forecast, what is GDP at the moment. So I can collect a lot of data and I can try to do what is called a nowcast of GDP. Then we do like this short or medium term forecast up to 3 years. And then for that, you can use models. Then on top of the models, you can put this expert judgment. That is, I know a better story, or I know something which is not captured in the models, and I can put that in my forecast. And then the important thing is that then we want to do some scenarios or risk analysis. Risk analysis, for example, what is the probability that inflation is higher than 2% if something bad happens? What is the probability that we are in a recession if A, B, and C happen? So these things we can do them with models, no? So all these things that I put in red actually are things that we use models at the ECB for. Now, I have to say, that as I mentioned before, we use a lot of data, and we use this data in the models that we have are estimated. And especially in recent years, there has been an explosion of methodologies to do economic forecasts using models, using a lot of data. I mean, I'm not sure, probably some of you are already invested in all these machine learning algorithms or neural networks and these things. All these things are exploding. It's very topical right now. But we have to consider that when we build our models, so there are many challenges, when we want to do an economic model. So there are structural changes, there are changes in how policy is conducted, there are non-linearities, there are things that happen that are totally unexpected. But let me emphasize here what I think is that I don't think that if you have a model and this model is not good at forecasting, that does not mean that the model is bad. So suppose, for example, I have this analogy that I read long time ago. Suppose that you have a rocket, and then you are sending the rocket to space. You have very good engineering. The rocket works perfectly fine. You have estimated very well what is going to be the trajectory of the rocket. And then once the rocket is close to the moon, an asteroid comes and hits the rocket. And then the rocket is going to be deviated. So then that is going to be, the new trajectory of the rocket is going to be very different than your anticipated trajectory. But that doesn't mean that everything that you did was wrong. It's just that something happened, something that was totally unexpected, that derailed your forecast in this case. And also there is another thing, that there are many different models. And the best models that explain what has happened in the past, the best models that can explain GDP and inflation developments, for example, might not be the best models to forecast. And this is something that we always have to take into account, and we consider that. Now, what type of models can we use to do forecasting? So, of course, we can use, probably you have seen in your econometrics classes, some time series models, or what we call also reduced form models. And these are models that are just driven by data. And, it's like linear regressions, autoregressive models, vector autoregressive models. The good thing about these models is that they are very easy to estimate, or to introduce things that might be a bit complicated, like structural changes or non-linearities. But these models are mostly about correlations, okay? And then I come back to this later. Then we have what we call some semi-structural models, which again is models that are very driven by data, okay? But they have some economic structure. For example, consumption has to be a percentage of GDP. The interest rates have to react to inflation and these things. It's still not perfect causality models, but they are very flexible and allow you to have some economic structure when you want to do your forecast. Like, for example, wages are going to react, I don't know, 1-to-1 to expected inflation. So these things, you can impose them in the models. And then you have what is called more like a structural or DSG models. Probably you don't know what is this, or many of you don't know. But I guess that in your macro classes, you have studied these ISLM models or supply demand models. So a DSG model is that on steroids. Okay, like it's super complicated. You can have hundreds of equations, and these are very complicated models. But these are the best models to do causal analysis. Questions such as, if the interest rate increases 50 basis points, what's going to happen to GDP and inflation? If the price of gas increases 100 euros per megawatt hour, what's going to happen to inflation and GDP? These are the best models to try to answer this type of questions. But these models are not very flexible and they are difficult to estimate. But at the end, every of these models, they serve a purpose, they are complementary to each other. And it's always good to have a diverse view of the different models and the different results before making a final decision. So at the end, when you do forecast and you take any macroeconomic model, at the end, using a model just boils down to say that your data today is a function, okay, I don't know what that function is, of past data. So I want to estimate the historical correlations in the data to forecast, given those correlations to forecast the futures. For example, so if in the past the correlation between GDP and inflation has been 0.5, I know that if I think that GDP next year is going to be 1%, inflation would increase by 0.5%. Okay, so that's a bit of the idea. But then also news about the future, expected values, and also some shocks, this epsilon thing that are the asteroids that are going to hit the rockets. Okay, very simple examples. We don't use this, no, but I mean, these are very simple examples that probably you have seen. It's an autoregressive process of order one, which is that, for example, GDP today depends on GDP yesterday. That's it. Or GDP today depends on GDP yesterday and inflation could be that X. Okay, so these are very small models. But at the end, for forecasting, we use very large and complicated models. Very simple example, and this is just to give you a little bit of an idea of the things that I want to go a bit later. But suppose that I want to forecast GDP growth using this autoregressive process of order one. Okay, so GDP only depends on GDP yesterday. I can construct the forecast, no, and then you don't need to look at the equations, but this is my data, the blue line, this is the data. I had to trim it, otherwise we have the COVID there for GDP. Then this is my last period of data, and then I do the forecast with this model. Fine, I have a forecast for GDP, but that's a very naive forecast because this excludes, for example, the relationship with other variables, like what is the impact of the war? What is the impact of the high gas prices? What is the impact of interest rates, which now are increasing, and that is going to impact GDP? You don't have that in the model, okay? So you need to be aware of the things when you're constructing a forecast of the things that you have and that you don't have. So at the end, of course, you can put a lot of data. Going back to these models that I told you that are more like time series or reduced form models. So these models, you can put a lot of data, no? And then you can just use like regressions or what is called factor models, or you can use machine learning techniques. Given all that data, you can forecast GDP. No? So you just tell the model, give me a forecast of GDP given all this data. And there are different types of models that you can do. The key outcome from this type of methodologies is that you want to capture correlations across the data properly. But if you want to do a causal statement, that's a bit trickier. And I will skip this because I realize that it's already 6:35. But of course, suppose that we have a good correlation. Okay, I have a good correlation between GDP and inflation, the historical correlation. And I want to do a forecast for the future, for GDP and for inflation, or for GDP given inflation. Okay, so this is the question. No? If I forecast, if I know that over the next year inflation is going to be very high, what is going to be my forecast for real GDP? So now we have to think of it as an economist, and we have to try to introduce some economic theory here, but also some more complicated models for a very good reason, because this is going to be very important for monetary policy. Let me explain you why. Probably you have seen, as I mentioned before, you have seen, or otherwise in introduction to economics, like supply, demand, and these things. Know that maybe you have studied the IS model, the Phillips curve model, No, but the idea is that suppose that we have a very simple demand curve for the economy. No, that GDP depends negatively on inflation. Okay, so when inflation is very high, GDP goes down. But then we also have a supply curve, or what is also in macroeconomics is the Phillips curve, which is way more complicated than this. No, but this comes from the production. No, when GDP, when the demand in this case goes up a lot, then inflation is going to be higher. No, and then of course we're going to have the point in which the supply and the demand are going to cross, and if you remember, that's what we call the equilibrium point. Okay. Now, I know, or I think, I am very sure that next year inflation is going to be very high. But it can happen, inflation can be very high for two reasons. It could be because suddenly people are getting crazy and there is more demand in the economy, people are demanding more and more things. And for example, during the COVID pandemic, many people were saving a lot of money. And when the economy reopened, there was what we call the pent-up demand. No? So there was a lot of demand for traveling, for example, for services that were closed during the pandemic. And in this case, if inflation is demand-driven, we see that yes, inflation is going to increase at the end in this new equilibrium point, and GDP will increase. But suppose that inflation is driven by supply because energy prices are very high, because gas has been rationed and the price of gas has gone over the roof. Okay. Now, what happens in this case? That the cost for companies are increasing a lot. People are facing much higher energy costs at home, so they are going to demand less things. Okay. Companies might not be able to produce as much as before. So in this case, this is a supply-driven shock. Okay, it's a supply asteroid, if you want to think like that. And then inflation is going to increase, but GDP is going to go down. And this is very important for monetary policy, because one of the transmission mechanisms of monetary policy is to cool down the economy, to cool down demand. If we increase the interest rate, lending rates are going to increase, mortgage rates are going to increase. And therefore, the idea is to cool down the economy a little bit so that demand goes down, and then we can cool down inflation. But in this situation, in which inflation is driven by supply, GDP is already going down. If we increase the interest rates, right, if the monetary policy makers decide to increase the interest rates or lending rates increase, it is going to be tricky because you will create even a larger drop on GDP. So policymakers always need to understand properly when you do a forecast, or what is happening is because of supply, or is it because of demand? Because this has very strong implications when you want to make a decision as a politician or a policymaker. Of course, in the ECB, we have a lot of models, no? And with these models, we can actually try to understand if what is happening at each period of time is mostly driven by supply or by demand. As I mentioned before, I can only show to you things that are public. So this is a chart. This is an outdated one. This is from the end of 2020, okay? But this is a public chart. And here we were trying to decompose what was happening with GDP and inflation into demand shocks, supply shocks, foreign shocks, because many times when something is coming from the foreign sector, it's very difficult also for policymakers, domestic policymakers to do something, no? I mean, I work at the European Central Bank. I mean, I cannot go and ask Putin to stop the war, right? So it's good for us that we can have these things, and this gives us a sense of the economic narrative also to produce the forecast. Because if I see that inflation is mostly driven by supply factors, when I make my forecast for GDP, I will probably do a reduction, or I will cut my forecast for GDP. So this is very, very, very important. Now, the problem is that recently, as you can imagine, with the pandemic, now with the war, it's very difficult to do any forecast. It's very difficult for me to say GDP is going to be 1.5%, inflation is going to be 2%. It's very difficult to just give a number, okay? So everything has become very uncertain. And, you know, we are starting to think, or many institutions, including the ECB, we are moving from trying to say GDP is going to be 1.5% to say, okay, GDP, we think it most likely will be 1.5%, but we think that there are factors that could decrease GDP or that will increase inflation and so on. So we generate what we call scenarios, and we do risk analysis. And this is where things are going right now. And this again is very important, because at the end it's very difficult to believe just a number, just a forecasting number, whether it comes from a model or from an expert is difficult. So at the end it's just, you want to make also some scenarios, not to think, okay, but what if the gas price increases 200% or things like this, no? So for example, in our projections, at the ECB projections, we started to publish since the beginning of this year what we call the downside scenario. What is this downside scenario? This downside scenario is not a catastrophic, but a very bad scenario compared to what we think it is going to be the most likely scenario for the economy. And then you see, we say, okay, we are going to assume that the gas prices are going to be 53% higher than what we think it will happen, okay? The oil prices are going to be 54% higher. Food prices are going to increase by 30%, no? And we construct these scenarios. And then we have, for example, our what we call the baseline projections, what we tell when Lagarde goes to the press conference, or in the past when Draghi went to the press conference, he said, okay, I think that GDP in 2022 will be 3.1%, HICP 8.1, and so on. But in the downside scenario, I think that GDP will be 2.8%, 8.4%, and we assign X probability to this scenario. So these things, this is what we do, okay? And this is very important again. We also did similar things during the pandemic. During the pandemic, we were constructing the scenarios in which we were assuming, okay, so what if the lockdowns are longer than what we expected, or not as longer as what we expected, no? And then we had what was our baseline scenario, which is the gray ones. Then we had what was a milder scenario, that is things were better than we anticipated with respect to vaccinations, with respect to the lockdowns. We even built a model in my department. We built a model in which we had a model for vaccination and recoveries and these things. And then we were putting that inside a macroeconomic model. So we were forecasting what would happen with the vaccination rates, with the infection rates. And given that, we were able to produce these scenarios, okay, like this mild or this severe or very bad scenario. So you can see again things that are very, very, very meaningful. And now what we are doing more and more is to, rather than, as I said, rather than just focusing on one number, what we produce is distributions. I mean, if you have studied the statistics, you know, so you haven't been seeing the normal distribution or these things. So these, for example, these are distributions that come from very different models that we have in my department. We run the forecasts with our models, and then we combine them. And then given the results from all the different models, we can create these distributions. And given this, we can say, okay, what is the probability that GDP is lower than zero? That is, that we have a recession. So given these distributions, this is something which is very easy to compute. Or the probability that inflation is to the right of 2%, okay? And for example, here you see like a chart that I was preparing also in the past, no, in which I was computing using a model which is called the new area Y model. I was computing the probability at each period of time that there was going to be deflation, no, and then you see when it becomes very red, that means that there were like high risks of deflation, or excess inflation risk, no, the probability that inflation was above 2% for some periods, some consecutive periods. And again, when it was red, it meant that the probability was very high, that inflation could be high. So you see, these things, we produce them, and when there are monetary policy decisions, it is based on this. And of course, indirectly, this is going to impact you, no? Because now that we are increasing the interest rates, we are normalizing the interest rates because inflation is higher. So of course, this is going to impact you if you want to buy a house, you want to get a mortgage, or if you want to get a loan for a car, or things like this. Or for companies, if they are planning to borrow money to buy a machine. So this is very, very, very important. And of course, right now, you see, it's one of the most critical periods in which we need to understand properly if inflation is driven by supply or if inflation is driven by demand, because this is going to determine a lot what's going to happen with monetary policy over the future. It seems, for example, it's very interesting in the sense that if you compare the euro area with the United States, In the United States, it seems when you run the models that inflation in the United States is mostly driven by demands, but in the euro area, it's a bit trickier for monetary policy because most of the inflation is driven by supply, by the energy crisis, by gas prices, and so on. So just
Carlos,
to conclude,
just to let you feel more comfortable with time, I remind you that we have about 8 minutes left.
I know, thank you.
Okay,
but I think I can do everything in 8 minutes.
Perfect, thank you very much.
And then we can open the floor, and I can stay also a bit longer if necessary. No worries. So just to conclude, I hope that I have shown to you, that it's very difficult to do forecast. But again, remember always this thing that I said. It's very important that even if your forecasts are not good, that doesn't mean that models are bad, no? And that sometimes it's very good to try to have this narrative, this causality, these structural factors when you are building your forecast. It's very important because otherwise you can provide very bad narratives. And yeah, so nowadays we are moving from this point forecast, this number, to these scenarios or risk analysis. Now, in the last 5 minutes, okay, I know that some of you were very interested in train essays or how to work at the ECB. I have to tell you, for example, that if you check the ECB right now, the ECB webpage, in my department, we are hiring new trainees. Okay, so let me explain to you a bit how this works. I mean, you know probably a lot about the ECB, that the ECB is in Frankfurt, how it is composed, and so on. But for example, one important thing is that the ECB is a very young institution. Okay, so there are more than 500 trainees in 2021, and it's like around the average age is 26 years old and 31 for another program which is called the graduate program. And the majority of the staff is actually quite young. It's a very nice place to be. Frankfurt is okay, but I mean, the ECB is a fantastic place to be, to learn, especially if you are really passionate about economics. The ECB is in Europe the place to be, together with some national central banks. Banca d'Italia is an excellent central bank, for example, when it comes also to research, and the people who work there are really smart and fantastic. We offer a lot of things, like private health insurance. If you are a trainee, you get an apartment for free in Frankfurt. There are gyms at the ECB and so on, and there are also plenty of opportunities, and I think this is very important. There are a lot of opportunities to learn new things at the ECB. You can do courses, you can attend a lot of seminars, a lot of conferences, and so on. And yeah, I mean, it's a very diverse place. The ECB also, there are, it's not only economists there. There are lawyers, there are people from IT, people who do accounting, and economists, And I mean, there are some networks, so we have the Rainbow Network, for example, for LGBTQ people. There are networks that are more for people of color or Black people, networks for people who have some type of disability. So we are open. It's a very diverse institution, very progressive in that sense. So if that is something that is of concern for you, even if sometimes it seems like the ECB is a very obscure place where it's a tower where we are there doing our things that no one understands. Now, what can we offer to you? So if you are interested in doing a trainee program, so what you will do is usually you need to have like a bachelor or a master's degree. In economics, usually a master's degree is not a requirement, but it's desired. And usually this lasts for 1 year. Okay, so you can be with us for 1 year. You will be working in one department, which is the department that you will apply to. And then in that department, so your tasks are going to depend on what department you work. In my department, I can tell you that you will be working with these economic models. So doing like the things that I have showed to you, like this understanding supply, demand, or all these things, you will be doing it in my department. Some people end up with research papers. Some people, after the masters, they go to do a PhD. We have sent people to do, in my department, people to do PhDs in Boston College, in Northwestern University, at the European University Institute in Florence. So to very, very, very good programs. And usually we pay you, this is net, 1,070 euros. If you are a master's trainee, but if you already have 3 years of a PhD, then that is almost 2,000 euros, plus housing. Okay, don't forget that the housing is, the ECB gives you the housing. I think as a trainee, it's a fantastic experience. You will learn a lot. It is going to open you a lot of doors. I started as a trainee at the ECB, and I was there as a PhD trainee when I was finishing my PhD. And then I got a permanent position, and I have been working there since 2015. So it's possible, no, as a trainee, then to go to an economist position and to make a career in the ECB. There is also another program which is called the graduate program, but this is for people who are finishing their PhD. And here it's a 3-year program. And in every year you're going to be in a different department. And then, so, I mean, they pay you much more because your role is more like an economist there. So you will start to have like a lot of decisions. You have to make decisions. You have to do more analytic work. You have to do presentations and these things. Now, just if you want to go to the ECB, you can check in this web page. It's clear in the, if you go to the ECB web page, you look for careers, and then you will see the positions that we have open at each period of time. There is a process in which, for you, in your case, for a trainee, the process is you apply, then we have to read all your applications, and then we will interview some of you. My advice in the interview, be yourself, try to explain the things that you have done, think how you think that your skills can contribute to the department. It's very laid back, no worries, don't get nervous, try to be yourself. We are very nice, generally, almost always we are nice. Okay, and yeah, as I said, okay, this is important, maybe just 1 minute. No, when you're at the interview, they are going to ask you questions, more like HR questions type, no, like behavioral questions, or even for your research, no, or if you have done any project. So it's important that you always think of this. It's HR lingo, no, but it's called this STAR model. But the idea is, if I ask you, for example, I don't know, something that, I mean, if suppose that you were in a situation where you will have to work in a team project in a school, no? So how was it? What did you do? So think always, okay, so this was the situation. I had to do this project with these people. The project was about this. What happened was this. There was a problem. We solved the problem. And since we solved the problem, it worked out very well. No? So things like this. Try to build a coherent story, a coherent narrative. It's very important in an interview that you show that you are a structured person. And also that in our case, we always ask questions about economics. No? So it's important that you are able to think as an economist. I'm not going to tell you the question that we're going to ask this year, of course, but I can tell you that last year we were asking the trainees, how do you think that the supply bottlenecks or the supply constraints are affecting GDP and inflation, and what are the transmission channels? So things like this. No? So try to, when you apply for a department, try to read what the department is doing. Now, my division is called Forecasting and Policy Modeling. We are within the Directorate General of Economics at the ECB. And what we do is that we have a lot of different models, very large models, like the ones that I showed you before for the results, not the small ones, those ones we don't use, of course. But we do a lot of work, you know, in contributing to the forecast, the projections, simulations about monetary policy, like what if the interest rate increases 50 basis points. We are always trying to be at the frontier of research, trying to use the newest models that are in the literature, trying to understand them, trying to provide an informed assessment of an economic narrative or the economic situation to the executive board, to the governing council. I mean, these are some examples of the models that we have. DSG, semi-structural, time series. We are starting to do things with machine learning, big data, and so on, if this is something that interests you, know. So, yeah, I didn't give you so much time, but I can stay a bit longer if necessary, if there are many questions or things. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your precious contribute. And I really enjoyed it. And I guess our participants did too, since we have a bunch of questions. I will go through just some of them since we are running out of time. Would you rather me to list them and then let you answer them, or shall we go one by one?
As you prefer, I don't mind. Maybe.
Okay, I'll go with both and then you can answer. So first of all, what are the backgrounds of workers at ECB? Are they mainly related to economics or more broadly, for example, mathematics or other backgrounds? And how was coping with pandemic times when European economy and the economy of the entire world was incredibly under stress? And more recently, during war times, which still goes on right now, does your workload increase?
Okay. Let me start maybe with the first one, which is the easiest one. So the background is very diverse. I can tell you, in my division, for example, which seems like, oh, it's just going to be economist. Not true. So I have right now one of these graduate program that I mentioned, graduate program participants, an Italian guy. He has a background in physics of materials, no? But at the end, you know, the thing is that when we hire someone who has a background in physics or in mathematics, it's because we think that there is something that you can contribute with. No, for example, I'm an economist. I can understand economics. I can do a lot of mathematical things, but many times I just face a wall when it comes to mathematical things because I have not studied properly mathematics nor statistics, even if most of the work that I do has a big component of mathematics and statistics. So it's very good for us that at the ECB there are very different types of people because then we can help each other. I mean, I can tell you that we even have chemical engineers, no? Because we have a department which is the banknotes department, and for example, I know that they are studying different types of ink for the banknotes or materials for the banknotes that could be more environmentally friendly. How did we cope with the pandemic? That was tough. So that was tough. I mean, first of all, more on the personal level, because they sent us home and we didn't really know how to work online. It was very difficult for the new people because, I mean, there were trainees, for example, that I never met in person. Okay, so that was tough in that sense, and also in terms of work, especially at the beginning. I was very proud at the end that some of the work that I did and my colleagues, you know, because we have, as I mentioned before, one of the things that we do in my department is that we do analysis, you know, like monetary policy simulations and these things. So I'm very proud that one of the things that we contributed to was this pandemic emergency purchase program. That now with perspective, some people might think that is one of the things that is driving the very high inflation right now. I have my doubts. I think it's mostly driven by what is happening with the war. And at the end, we always have to think, just one thing, I wanted to mention this before and I forgot, don't listen so much to this, what I call the TV economists, okay? A TV economist usually is really out of touch to what real economists are doing in an institution, in the university and so on. No? But at the moment, being able to push for this pandemic purchase program, you know, the counterfactual would have been very bad. So again, going back to forecasting, no, we have to forecast what was going to happen with the economy and what was going to happen with the economy if we were able to help the governments to buy all the medical material and everything. No? So I was very proud that the ECB jumped on that and that Christine Lagarde was also very fundamental in that jump. Now, it opened a lot of opportunities, I have to say, in the sense that in economics, this is similar to what happened in 2008. Look, and sorry, I know that we are running out of time, but I think this is interesting if you want to stay or not. No, but
if you agree, we can stay 5 minutes more, and I have another interesting question. So
perfect. So in 2008, you know, most of the macroeconomic models that were used in the universities or in institutions, there were no financial sector in those models. There were no financial frictions in those models. So when the financial crisis came, this was an opportunity for many researchers, for many economists, to start trying to understand better what is the role of the financial sector in the economy, how to put financial frictions in macroeconomic models, like, for example, determination of spreads, collateral constraints, many things that people were not paying so much attention before in economics. So with the pandemic, it has been the same. And now also with the war, And the world, this energy crisis also a bit related now with climate change. There is, in my department, for example, we are investing now a lot in putting climate change into macroeconomic models. Something that people were not paying so much attention before, but now it's crucial. And we need to understand how climate change can impact the economy. And it could have a very strong impact. So yeah, it opened opportunities for that, to do a lot of work, but it was very interesting work. Did it increase our workload? Yes, it did, because we had already committed to do a strategy review also of the ECB. Many of us were working a lot, but at the end, I have to say that it pays off. And then the ECB is very generous then if you want to do some rebalancing, or if you want to take some days off and these things. And the ECB, especially if you have a good manager, and for example, in my case, I have fantastic managers in my department that are very understanding, no? And they see that if during 1 week or 2 weeks you are working a lot, they are going to ask you directly to take some days off to recover. But I see this again as opportunities. And it sounds very HR lingo, but it's true, because right now, you know, I started to work right now in a project in which I try to understand some non-linearities on inflation, and it's because of the energy crisis, no? And this energy crisis, then suddenly the governing council, the executive board, you know, Philip Lane, Lagarde, Isabel Schnabel, they start to ask this type of questions. It's like, but are we in the same, let's put it this way, is the economic model now the same as the economic model 5 years ago? And we have to try to understand those things. And I mean, if you're an economist and if you're passionate about economics, it's something super, super interesting. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Just very briefly, in 1 minute, when you construct the downside scenario forecast, based on which factors you agree on the assumptions to construct the model?
Okay, there are many assumptions there. Okay, so first of all, as I said, the price of gas, the price of oil, long-term rates, you know, some financial factors, but there are plenty of nitty-gritty details. No, I can tell you that constructing that downside scenario could take like 2 or 3 months to do it. No, because we have to make assumptions. For example, are we going to assume that we are going to be able to substitute gas for other energy sources or not? How long are we going to assume that the war is going to last? So all these things, we have to consider them. It is true that many of these things, we don't have it in our models. At the end, you have to be creative, no? And you have to be able to map all these factors that you want to impose in the downside scenario. You want to impose that in the model. And there are different ways of doing it that could take me a lot of time to explain it. But mostly the factors that we were considering is what is happening with gas prices, what is happening with oil prices, and what is happening from the financial side. But again, there were assumptions made there, such as we assumed at the end, there was an assumption that there was no possibility of substitution between gas and other energy sources. So this downside scenario is something that it's a very bad one. Okay, something very bad. Like, for example, that over the winter, for example, we also assumed that the winter was going to be very cold. I can say these things because everything is public. It is explained in this in our projection document. No? So we were assuming that the winter that is coming now, we assume that it is going to be very cold. This implies that the demand for energy is going to be very high, right? If the demand for energy is very high, but then there is no supply of gas, there is no supply of energy, prices are going to increase significantly more than what we have in our baseline scenario. Yeah. But you see that all these things are the things that you have to consider when you are doing a forecast. It's very tricky, it's very intricate. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Carlos, for having been with us this evening. Thank you, Emil, and thank you to all the members of the Associazione Allievi who helped in organizing this event. And thank you to the Collegio Carlo Alberto for the support and the technical support as well. So keep an eye on our pages, and we hope to see you soon at the Collegio for the next events. Good evening to everyone.